The December morning light filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the polished floors where King Charles III stood in quiet contemplation. His hands, weathered by age and responsibility, held the carefully typed draft of his fourth Christmas message as monarch. The weight of tradition pressed upon his shoulders, yet this year felt different. This year, there was something more personal he needed to say. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had endured what many would consider the most challenging year of her life. The cancer diagnosis had arrived like a thunderbolt in early spring, turning the carefully orchestrated royal calendar into chaos. Charles remembered the phone call from William, his voice barely steady as he shared the devastating news. The king had felt his own heartbreak in that moment, not just as a monarch concerned for a key member of his family, but as a father-in-law who had grown to love Catherine as his own daughter. The past months had been a masterclass in grace under pressure. While the public saw carefully crafted statements and occasional glimpses of the princess during her treatment, Charles witnessed something far more profound. He saw a young woman who refused to let fear define her, who found strength in the darkest moments, and who somehow managed to be a pillar of support for others even while fighting her own battles. Margaret Hartwell, the king's private secretary, entered the room with her usual quiet efficiency. She had served the royal household for over 2 decades, and Charles trusted her judgment implicitly. Her silver hair was pulled back in its familiar chignon, and her keen eyes immediately noticed the contemplative expression on the king's face. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "the BBC team will arrive in 2 hours for the recording. Is there anything you need to discuss about the message?" Charles turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting the weight of his thoughts. "Margaret, how do you think the public would receive a more personal message this year? Something that speaks to the struggles many families face?" Margaret paused, understanding immediately what the king was considering. "Sir, in my experience, the public appreciates authenticity. They've watched the Princess of Wales with great admiration this year. If your Majesty chooses to acknowledge her strength, I believe it would resonate deeply." The king nodded slowly. He had been wrestling with this decision for weeks. Royal Christmas messages traditionally focused on broader themes of service, faith, and community. Personal family matters were typically kept private, shared only in the most general terms. But this year felt different. This year, the royal family's struggles had been lived out in the public eye, and Charles felt a responsibility to acknowledge what so many had witnessed and supported. As Margaret left the room, Charles's mind wandered to a conversation he had shared with Catherine just weeks before. She had been at Anmer Hall, recovering from her latest treatment session. The Norfolk countryside was dressed in autumn colors, and they had walked slowly through the gardens, her arm linked through his for support. "I never imagined," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "how many letters I would receive from people going through the same thing. Mothers writing about their own battles, children drawing pictures to make me smile, entire communities sending their love. It makes me realize how connected we all are in our struggles." Charles had been moved by her words, but, more than that, he had been inspired by her perspective. Even in her own pain, Catherine was thinking about others. Even in her moment of vulnerability, she was finding ways to serve and connect. It was, he realized, the very essence of what the monarchy should represent. The draft in his hands had gone through several revisions. His initial instinct was to keep things traditionally formal, to speak in the measured tones that had characterized his previous Christmas messages. But something kept pulling him toward a different approach. The year had been marked by unprecedented challenges, not just for the royal family, but for people across the Commonwealth and beyond. Economic uncertainties, health crises, climate concerns, and social divisions had tested communities everywhere. Perhaps this was the moment for a more human touch. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of William and Catherine themselves. The Prince of Wales entered first, his tall frame filling the doorway, followed by Catherine. She moved with careful grace, her recovery evident in the slight deliberateness of her steps, but her smile was genuine and warm. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair falling in gentle waves around her shoulders, and Charles was struck once again by her natural elegance. "Father," William said, embracing Charles warmly. "Thank you for inviting us to be here today." Catherine approached and kissed Charles gently on both cheeks, a gesture that had become natural over their years of growing closeness. "I hope we're not intruding on your preparation time," she said. "Never," Charles replied firmly. "In fact, I was hoping we might talk. I've been thinking about this year's message, and I wanted your thoughts on something." They settled in the comfortable sitting area near the fireplace. Catherine chose the chair closest to the warmth, and Charles noticed William's protective glance in her direction. The bond between the couple had deepened through their trials, becoming something almost visible in the way they moved around each other, the silent communication that passed between them. "I've been considering acknowledging more directly the challenges this year has brought," Charles began carefully. "Not just to our family, but to so many families facing similar struggles. I wonder if there's value in speaking more personally about resilience, about finding strength in difficulty." Catherine was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience. "I think," she said slowly, "that people appreciate honesty. Not the kind that overshares or makes them uncomfortable, but the kind that acknowledges shared humanity. This year has taught me that vulnerability can be a form of strength, not weakness." William reached over and took her hand. "Catherine has received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories," he added. "It's remarkable how her openness has created space for others to feel less alone in their struggles." Charles felt something settle in his chest, a sense of certainty that had been eluding him. Then, perhaps it's time for a different kind of Christmas message. One that honors not just the traditional themes, but the very real human experiences that have shaped this year. As they continued to talk, the king found himself sharing details about the message he was crafting. He spoke about his desire to acknowledge Catherine's strength without making her the focus, to use her example as a way to speak to the broader themes of resilience and community support that had emerged from their family's challenges. Catherine listened intently, occasionally offering insights drawn from her own experience. "What struck me most," she said at one point, "was how kindness seemed to multiply during the hardest times. People I had never met were praying for me, sending flowers, sharing their own stories of hope. It reminded me that we're all connected in ways we don't always recognize." The conversation continued as the morning progressed. Charles shared his vision for weaving these themes into the traditional Christmas message format, speaking about faith and service while acknowledging the very human struggles that test both. William offered perspective on how such a message might be received by younger audiences, while Catherine provided insights into the experience of being on the receiving end of public support during private trials. By the time the BBC crew arrived, Charles felt a clarity about his message that had been missing before. The technical preparations began with their usual efficiency. Cameras were positioned, lighting was adjusted, and sound levels were tested. The familiar ritual of creating the Christmas message was underway, but this year it felt different. This year, it felt more important. Director James Morrison had overseen royal broadcasts for nearly a decade. He understood the delicate balance required to create messages that felt both intimate and appropriately formal. As he watched the king during the preparation process, he sensed something different in His Majesty's demeanor. There was a thoughtfulness, a deeper intentionality that went beyond the usual careful consideration. "Your Majesty," Morrison said during a break in the setup, "would you like to do a brief run-through of the opening? We can adjust the camera angles if needed." Charles nodded, taking his position behind the desk that had been arranged for the recording. The setting was elegant but not ostentatious, designed to feel welcoming rather than intimidating. Family photographs were carefully placed in the background, including a recent portrait of William, Catherine, and their children that had been taken during the summer. As he began to speak the opening words of his message, Charles felt the weight of what he was about to share with millions of people around the world. This wasn't just a Christmas greeting, it was an opportunity to acknowledge shared struggles and celebrate shared strength. It was a chance to honor Catherine's courage without exploiting it, to speak to the very real challenges people faced while offering genuine hope. The afternoon light continued to shift through the windows as the final preparations were completed. Soon, the cameras would roll, and the king would deliver his fourth Christmas message. But, for now, in these quiet moments before recording began, he felt the presence of something larger than royal tradition. He felt the weight of human connection, the power of acknowledged vulnerability, and the strength that comes from community support. Catherine and William had remained nearby throughout the preparations, offering quiet encouragement and occasional suggestions. Their presence reminded Charles why this message mattered so much. It wasn't just about royal duty or constitutional obligation. It was about using the platform of the monarchy to acknowledge what really mattered in people's lives, to speak to their hopes and fears with genuine understanding. As the final checks were completed and the recording was about to begin, Charles took a deep breath. In his hands, he held not just words on a page, but the hopes and struggles of an entire year. The message he was about to deliver would travel across the Commonwealth and beyond, reaching families gathering around Christmas tables, individuals spending the holiday alone, communities celebrating together despite their challenges. The red light on the camera began to glow, signaling that the recording had begun. King Charles III looked directly into the lens, and, in that moment, he was speaking not just as a monarch, but as someone who had witnessed extraordinary courage in the face of extraordinary challenges. He was about to honor Catherine in the most public way possible, while speaking to the broader themes of resilience, community, and hope that her example had illuminated throughout the most difficult year of her life. The recording had gone smoothly, but, as the BBC crew packed their equipment and departed from Windsor Castle, King Charles found himself in an unexpected state of reflection. The message he had just delivered felt different from his previous Christmas addresses, more personal yet somehow more universal. He had managed to weave Catherine's story into a broader narrative about resilience and community support without making her the singular focus, exactly as he had intended. Margaret Hartwell approached him as the last of the technical equipment was wheeled from the room. "Your Majesty, that was beautifully done." The mention of the Princess of Wales felt natural and respectful. Charles nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "I hope Catherine feels the same way." This was as much about honoring her strength as it was about speaking to others facing similar challenges. The king had crafted his words carefully, speaking about a member of our family who had faced health challenges with remarkable grace, drawing lessons about courage and community support from her experience without sensationalizing her private struggle. He had managed to acknowledge what the public already knew while maintaining the dignity and privacy that the situation demanded. As evening approached, Charles made his way to his private study, a room that had become his sanctuary during the most challenging moments of his reign. The walls were lined with books that had shaped his thinking over decades, photographs that captured meaningful moments, and artwork that brought him peace. Tonight, as he settled into his favorite chair, his thoughts remained fixed on the months leading up to this Christmas message. The year had begun with such promise. Catherine had been preparing for a busy spring schedule, her engagement calendar filled with visits to schools, hospitals, and community organizations. Her early childhood development work was gaining international recognition, and she had been looking forward to launching several new initiatives. Then, in late January, came the unexpected hospital admission for what was initially described as planned abdominal surgery. Charles remembered visiting her during those first days in the private hospital. She had been weak but determined, insisting that she would be back to her full schedule within weeks. None of them had anticipated the devastating diagnosis that would emerge from routine post-surgical testing. The word cancer had changed everything in an instant. The king's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the study door. Catherine herself appeared, having returned to Windsor after the recording to spend the evening with family. She looked tired but peaceful, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl that had been a gift from Queen Camilla. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," she said quietly. "I wanted to thank you for what you said today." Charles rose from his chair and gestured toward the comfortable seating area near the fireplace. "Please, sit with me. I was hoping we would have a chance to talk about the message." As they settled together, Catherine's composure was evident, but Charles could see the emotional weight she still carried. "When William told me what you were planning to include about my health journey, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. But, hearing your words today, the way you connected my experience to something larger, it felt right." "Your courage this year has been extraordinary," Charles said simply. "Not just in facing your diagnosis and treatment, but in how you've allowed others to share in that journey. The letters, the support, the way you've used your experience to help others feel less alone, it's exactly what the monarchy should represent." Catherine was quiet for a moment, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I never imagined how vulnerable I could feel, even with all the support we have. But I also never imagined how much strength could come from allowing people to care for you. The messages I received from other cancer patients, from families going through similar struggles, they gave me more hope than any medical treatment." The king understood exactly what she meant. Throughout his own life, he had witnessed the power of human connection during difficult times. But, watching Catherine navigate her diagnosis and treatment had shown him something new about the relationship between vulnerability and strength, between private struggle and public service. "There was one letter in particular," Catherine continued, her voice growing softer. "From a woman named Sarah in Manchester. She had been diagnosed with the same type of cancer 6 months before me. She wrote about feeling isolated and afraid, but when my diagnosis became public, she said it helped her feel less alone. She started a support group at her local hospital, and, by the time she wrote to me, it had grown to over 30 people. Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. That's remarkable. She sent me a photograph from one of their meetings, Catherine said, reaching into her purse to pull out a small printed photo. 30 people who found each other because they saw that someone they thought had everything could still face the same fears they were facing. They called themselves Catherine's Warriors, but really, they were warriors for each other. The photograph showed a diverse group of people of various ages, all holding hands in what appeared to be a hospital conference room. Their faces showed the wear of difficult treatments, but their smiles were genuine and their eyes held hope. Charles studied the image, understanding that this was exactly what he had tried to capture in his Christmas message. "This is why I felt it was important to include your story," he said. "Not because it's extraordinary in its uniqueness, but because it's extraordinary in its universality." Every family represented in that photograph, every person watching the Christmas message who has faced similar challenges, they need to know that struggle doesn't diminish dignity, that vulnerability can be a form of strength. As they continued talking, Catherine shared more details about her treatment journey that the public would never know. The days when getting out of bed felt impossible, the moments of fear that struck without warning, the careful balance of protecting her children while being honest about her condition. But she also spoke about unexpected moments of joy, about the ways her illness had deepened her relationships and clarified her priorities. "One morning in April, during my worst week of chemotherapy, George came into my room before school," she recalled. "I was feeling terrible, barely able to lift my head from the pillow. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, 'Mama, you don't have to be brave for us. We're brave for you too.' I realized I had been trying so hard to protect them that I hadn't allowed them to be part of my healing." Charles found himself deeply moved by this glimpse into the private moments that had shaped Catherine's journey. "How did that change things?" "We started having what Charlotte called honesty talks. Every Sunday evening, we would sit together as a family and share how we were really feeling about everything. Not just my illness, but school, friends, worries, hopes." William was hesitant at first, worried about burdening the children, but it became the most important part of our week. The king understood the wisdom in this approach. For too long, the royal family had operated under the assumption that protecting others meant hiding struggles. But Catherine's experience was teaching them all about the power of appropriate openness, about the way shared vulnerability could strengthen rather than weaken relationships. "Louis surprised me the most," Catherine continued. "He started drawing pictures of what he called brave moments. Not just my brave moments, but brave moments from everyone in the family. William being nervous before a big speech but doing it anyway. Charlotte standing up for a friend who was being teased. George trying a food he was scared to taste. He helped us all see that bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." As the evening progressed, their conversation deepened. Catherine spoke about the strange gift her illness had given her, the way it had forced her to slow down and truly see the life she was living. She talked about long afternoons spent reading with her children, about conversations with William that went deeper than their usual discussions of schedules and obligations, about quiet moments of prayer that had sustained her through the darkest times. "I kept a journal throughout treatment," she said. "Not for posterity or anything official, just for myself. Writing helped me process what was happening, helped me find meaning in the confusion. One entry I wrote after a particularly difficult day, I want to share with you." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her notes. "I wrote, 'Today I felt more afraid than I have since this journey began. But tonight, as I tucked the children into bed, Charlotte whispered that she had been praying for me every night, not just for me to get better, but for me to feel loved while I was getting better.' I realized that healing isn't just about the medicine working or the treatments succeeding. It's about feeling held by love while the healing happens." Charles felt tears gathering in his eyes. This was the heart of what he had tried to convey in his Christmas message, the understanding that strength comes not from facing challenges alone, but from allowing love and support to carry us through difficulty. "Your journey has taught all of us so much," he said quietly. "Not just about courage or resilience, but about the importance of community, about the way people can support each other through the most challenging times." Catherine nodded. "I've received over 15,000 letters since my diagnosis became public. Each one represents someone who took time from their own life to reach out to mine. Many of them shared their own stories, their own fears, their own hopes. Reading those letters became part of my healing process. Not just because they encouraged me, but because they reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my experience was part of a much larger human story. The fire had burned lower as they talked, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the study. Outside, the December evening had settled into full darkness, but, inside this room, the conversation had created a warm intimacy that made the challenging year feel somehow more manageable. "There's something else I want you to know," Catherine said, her voice growing even quieter. "When you first told me you were considering including my story in your Christmas message, I was terrified. Not because I didn't trust you to handle it appropriately, but because it meant acknowledging publicly that this year had changed me. That I wasn't the same person who had started the year with such confidence and plans." Charles waited for her to continue. "But, as I thought about it more, I realized that acknowledging change isn't the same as acknowledging defeat. This year has changed me, but, in many ways, it has changed me for the better. I'm more aware of what truly matters, more grateful for ordinary moments, more connected to the people I love. If sharing that can help others facing similar challenges, then it feels like the right thing to do." The king reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Your willingness to be open about struggle and growth, it's exactly what people need to hear. Especially during Christmas, when so many people are dealing with their own challenges while trying to maintain hope and celebration." As their conversation began to wind down, Catherine shared one final thought that had been weighing on her mind. "I keep thinking about next Christmas, about how different it will hopefully be. But I also don't want to rush past this Christmas, this moment where we're still in the middle of the story rather than at the end of it. There's something valuable about acknowledging where we are right now, not just where we hope to be." Charles understood completely. The Christmas message he had recorded earlier that day had tried to capture exactly this sentiment, the importance of finding meaning and connection in the midst of ongoing challenges rather than only after they had been resolved. As Catherine prepared to leave and rejoin William and the children, she turned back to Charles one more time. "Thank you for using your voice to honor not just my experience, but the experience of everyone who faces difficulties with grace. Your message today will reach people who need to know that their struggles matter, that their courage is seen and valued." After she left, Charles remained in his study for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. The Christmas message would be broadcast in just a few days, carrying his carefully crafted words to millions of people around the world. But, tonight, he felt certain that he had found the right balance between personal acknowledgement and universal truth, between royal tradition and human authenticity. The days following the recording of the Christmas message brought an unexpected calmness to Windsor Castle. King Charles found himself walking the grounds each morning, regardless of the December weather, using the time to reflect on the year that was drawing to a close. The bare branches of the ancient oak stood stark against the gray sky, but there was something beautiful in their winter simplicity, a reminder that strength could exist even in apparent bareness. 3 days before Christmas, as Charles made his way through the castle corridors after his morning walk, he encountered Dr. Emily Richardson, who had just finished a private consultation with Catherine. Dr. Richardson had been Catherine's primary oncologist throughout her treatment, and her presence at Windsor had become a familiar and reassuring sight over the past months. "Your Majesty," Dr. Richardson said with a respectful nod. "I hope you don't mind my saying, but I understand you included some reference to the princess's journey in your Christmas message." Charles paused, studying the doctor's expression. Dr. Richardson was a woman in her early 50s, with graying auburn hair and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in the most difficult circumstances. She had guided Catherine through every stage of her treatment with a combination of medical expertise and genuine compassion. "I did," Charles replied carefully. "I hope that was appropriate. I felt it was important to acknowledge what so many families have experienced this year." Dr. Richardson smiled, and Charles was struck by the warmth in her expression. "More than appropriate, sir. In my 25 years of oncology practice, I've seen how isolation can complicate healing. When public figures like the princess share their experiences thoughtfully, it creates permission for others to seek help, to talk openly about their fears, to accept support." They walked together toward the morning room, where Charles had planned to review the final preparations for Christmas Day activities. "Has Catherine's openness made a difference in your practice?" he asked. "Significantly," Dr. Richardson replied without hesitation. "Since the princess's diagnosis became public, our support group registrations have increased by over 200%. But, more importantly, patients are arriving for consultations earlier, more willing to discuss their symptoms honestly, more open to accepting help from family and friends." Charles found this information deeply moving. So the Christmas message, acknowledging her strength and the broader themes of community support, that might actually help people? I believe it will make a profound difference, Dr. Richardson said firmly. People facing health challenges often feel they need to be strong all the time, that showing vulnerability is somehow a failure. When they see someone they admire speaking honestly about struggle while still maintaining dignity and hope, it gives them permission to be human in their own difficult moments. As they reached the morning room, Dr. Richardson paused. There's something else, Your Majesty. The princess mentioned that you've been particularly supportive throughout this journey, not just as the king, but as family. That kind of support within families facing cancer makes an enormous difference in treatment outcomes. Love really is medicine. After Dr. Richardson departed, Charles settled at his desk to review the correspondence that had been arriving since news of the Christmas message recording had quietly circulated among palace staff. Margaret Hartwell had prepared a summary of early responses from Commonwealth leaders and church officials who had been given advance notice of the message's themes. The Archbishop of Canterbury called this morning, Margaret reported as she entered the room with a tea service. He wanted to express his appreciation for what he called the pastoral heart of this year's message. He feels it will resonate particularly well with congregations who have experienced loss and challenge. Charles poured himself tea, considering these words. Throughout his life, he had tried to understand the pastoral role of monarchy, the way the institution could provide comfort and strength during difficult times. But this year had taught him something new about that responsibility. What about responses from the Commonwealth realms, he asked. Margaret consulted her notes. Particularly positive, sir. The Governor-General of Canada mentioned that their country has seen significant increases in cancer diagnoses among younger people, and she believes your message will provide comfort to many families. The Prime Minister of New Zealand noted that the themes of community resilience will speak directly to their ongoing recovery from recent natural disasters. As Margaret left to attend to other duties, Charles found himself thinking about the interconnectedness of human experience that his Christmas message had tried to capture. Catherine's cancer journey, while deeply personal to their family, was part of a much larger story of how people support each other through crisis. His reflection was interrupted by the arrival of William, who appeared in the doorway looking somewhat concerned. Father, might I have a word? There's something I'd like to discuss about the Christmas message. Charles gestured for his son to join him, noting the tension in William's posture. Of course. Is something troubling you? William settled into the chair across from his father's desk, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Charles recognized as a sign of internal conflict. I've been thinking about the message you recorded, about the way you honored Catherine's experience. I'm grateful, truly, but I'm also wondering about the response it might generate. What kind of response concerns you? The attention, William said quietly. Catherine has worked so hard to maintain some privacy around her treatment, to protect the children from too much public scrutiny. I worry that even a tasteful acknowledgement in your Christmas message might open floodgates of media attention that could be overwhelming. Charles understood his son's protective instincts completely. I've been mindful of that throughout the process. The message acknowledges her strength and uses her experience to speak to broader themes, but it doesn't provide details or invite intrusion. It's meant to honor her courage while speaking to universal experiences of challenge and community support. William was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting emotions. She's been so strong throughout everything, but there are still difficult days. Days when the fatigue is overwhelming, when the uncertainty feels crushing. I don't want her to feel pressure to be a symbol when she's still healing. That's precisely why I approached it the way I did, Charles replied gently. The message honors her strength without creating expectations for public appearances or additional duties. It acknowledges what people have already witnessed while respecting her ongoing need for privacy and recovery time. As they continued talking, William's tension began to ease. He shared details about Catherine's current state that only family would know. The gradual return of energy that came in waves, the way she was slowly resuming some of her favorite activities, the ongoing process of helping their children understand that healing takes time. She started painting again last week, William said with a small smile. Nothing elaborate, just watercolors in the conservatory during afternoon light. But, seeing her absorbed in something creative again, something that brings her joy rather than obligation, it felt like seeing her come back to herself. Charles felt a warm satisfaction at this news. That's wonderful. Has she always painted? Since she was young, but she had stopped once royal duties became so consuming. This year has reminded us both about the importance of keeping space for the things that feed our souls, not just the things that fulfill our duties. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter echoing through the castle corridors. George, Charlotte, and Louis had arrived for their extended Christmas stay, and their presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the entire residence. Charles found himself smiling at the sound, remembering how his own children had brought similar energy to these same halls decades earlier. They seemed to be adapting well to everything, Charles observed. William nodded. Better than we expected in some ways. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure in their parents' love and honest communication. Catherine's illness has actually brought us closer together as a family. We spend more time talking, more time simply being present with each other. As if summoned by their conversation, the children appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from running through the castle corridors. Charlotte immediately went to her grandfather, wrapping her arms around his waist in an enthusiastic hug. "Grandpapa," she exclaimed. "Mama said you might show us the Christmas tree before the official lighting tomorrow." George and Louis flanked their father, and Charles was struck by how much they had grown over the challenging year. George, now 11, carried himself with increasing maturity, while 9-year-old Charlotte had developed an even more pronounced sense of empathy and care for others. 6-year-old Louis remained the family's source of unpredictable joy, his energy and curiosity undimmed by the difficulties they had faced. "Would you like to see it now?" Charles asked, delighted by their enthusiasm. The small procession made its way to the state dining room, where the magnificent Christmas tree stood in all its prepared glory. At 15 feet tall, it was decorated with ornaments that represented the traditions of the Commonwealth realms, each one carefully chosen to reflect the diversity and unity of the nations Charles served. "It's beautiful," Charlotte whispered, her young face illuminated by the soft lights. "Tell me about this ornament," Louis said, pointing to a particularly intricate decoration near eye level. Charles knelt down to Louis's height, bringing himself closer to the ornament in question. "This one comes from Australia, made by Aboriginal artisans. It represents the importance of storytelling in keeping families and communities connected across time and distance." As they moved around the tree, Charles found himself explaining the significance of various decorations, but, more importantly, he was observing how the children interacted with each other and processed the year they had experienced. Charlotte, in particular, seemed more thoughtful than usual, asking questions about traditions and meaning rather than simply enjoying the visual spectacle. "Grandpapa," she said quietly as they examined ornaments from the Caribbean realms, "Mama told us that you talked about her being brave in your Christmas message. Will people understand that being brave doesn't mean not being scared?" The question struck Charles with its profound wisdom. "What do you think, Charlotte?" She considered this seriously. "I think some people might not understand at first. But maybe when they hear you explain it, they'll remember times when they had to be brave even though they were frightened." George, who had been listening intently, added his own perspective. "Like when Louis had to get stitches last year, but he still held Mama's hand and let the doctor help him, even though he was crying." Louis, seemingly unbothered by being the subject of this example, nodded vigorously. "I was very brave and very scared at the same time. Maybe that's what Mama was too." William, who had been watching this exchange with obvious pride, caught Charles's eye. The unspoken communication between them acknowledged the wisdom of their children's understanding. These young people had learned about courage not from abstract concepts, but from living through a year when bravery had been demonstrated daily in their own home. As they continued their tour of the Christmas preparations, Charles found himself thinking about how his Christmas message would be received by other children watching around the world. Children whose families were facing health challenges, economic hardship, displacement, or loss. Would they understand, as his grandchildren had, that acknowledging difficulty could coexist with maintaining hope? Later that evening, after the children had been settled with their evening stories and William had returned to Anmer Hall to prepare for Christmas Eve activities, Charles found himself in his study once again. But, this time, he was not alone. Catherine had requested a few minutes of his time, and she arrived carrying a leather portfolio that she placed carefully on the table beside her chair. "I wanted to share something with you before the Christmas message airs tomorrow," she said. "I've been working on a project throughout my treatment, something private that helped me process what was happening." She opened the portfolio to reveal a collection of watercolor paintings, each one small but exquisitely detailed. The first showed a hospital room window with morning light streaming across empty chairs, conveying both solitude and possibility. The second captured her children's hands reaching toward her during a difficult afternoon, their small fingers intertwined with hers. "These are remarkable," Charles said softly, studying each painting with care. "I painted them during treatment sessions, or in the quiet hours when I couldn't sleep," Catherine explained. "They helped me find beauty even in the most difficult moments, reminded me that creativity could coexist with healing." As they moved through the collection, Charles saw the progression of Catherine's journey captured in watercolor. Images of medical equipment transformed into abstract patterns, nurses' compassionate faces rendered with loving detail, family moments elevated to sacred significance through artistic interpretation. The final painting in the collection showed a window view from Windsor Castle, the very room where they now sat, painted during one of Catherine's recovery visits. But, unlike a realistic representation, this painting showed the landscape through a prism of light, breaking familiar scenes into fragments of color that somehow created greater beauty than realistic representation might have achieved. "This one," Catherine said, pointing to the final image, "I painted the day I decided that my illness, while difficult, didn't have to define me as a victim. It could be part of a larger story about resilience, about finding light even when everything seems fragmented." Charles understood immediately why she had chosen to share these with him tonight, on the eve of his Christmas message broadcast. These paintings represented exactly what he had tried to capture in his words: the way beauty and meaning could emerge from difficulty, the way personal struggle could connect to universal themes of hope and community. "Thank you for sharing these with me," he said. "They help me understand even more clearly why tomorrow's message feels so important." As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the study door. "Whatever response the message receives tomorrow, I want you to know that having your support throughout this year has made all the difference. Not just the public acknowledgement, but the private conversations, the understanding, the way you've allowed our family's struggle to matter within the larger context of your responsibilities as king." After she left, Charles remained in his study until well past midnight, thinking about the paintings, about the conversations of recent days, about the message that would reach millions of people in just hours. He felt a sense of peace about what he had recorded, a certainty that honoring Catherine's courage was not just appropriate, but necessary for the kind of monarchy he wanted to represent. Christmas morning arrived at Windsor Castle with the particular stillness that comes with fresh snowfall. King Charles stood at his bedroom window, watching the grounds transform under a gentle blanket of white. In a few hours, his Christmas message would be broadcast across the Commonwealth and beyond, carrying words that had been crafted with such careful intention. But, for now, he allowed himself this quiet moment of anticipation. The message would air at 3 p.m., following the traditional schedule that had been established by his mother decades earlier. Between now and then, there would be family Christmas morning, church service, and the ritual of Christmas lunch that had remained largely unchanged despite all the challenges of the past year. Charles found comfort in this continuity, the way meaningful traditions could anchor a family even during the most turbulent times. A gentle knock interrupted his morning meditation. Margaret Hartwell entered carrying a tea service and the day's preliminary schedule. "Good morning, Your Majesty." "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Margaret," Charles replied warmly. "Any early responses to news that the broadcast includes more personal elements?" "The preliminary feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, sir," Margaret said as she poured his tea. The Archbishop of Canterbury's Christmas Eve service last night included prayers for all families facing health challenges, which many interpreted as a reference to your upcoming message. The response from Commonwealth leaders continues to be supportive. As Margaret left to oversee the morning's preparations, Charles made his way to the family quarters where Christmas morning was unfolding with all the controlled chaos that comes with excited children. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been awake since dawn, and their enthusiasm filled the corridors with an energy that made the castle feel more like a family home than a royal residence. Catherine was in the sitting room with the children, helping them organize their gifts while William managed the complex logistics of multiple families coordinating Christmas morning activities. She looked rested and peaceful, wearing a soft red sweater that brought color to her cheeks and made her appear more like her pre-diagnosis self than she had in months. "Grandpapa," Louis called out as Charles entered the room. "Look what Father Christmas brought." The next hour passed in the timeless ritual of Christmas morning gift exchanges. Charles found himself thinking about how this scene would be replicated in homes across the Commonwealth, families gathering to celebrate despite whatever challenges they might be facing. Some would be dealing with health crises like Catherine's, others with economic hardship, family conflicts, or personal losses. But, today, for these precious hours, they would focus on love and connection and hope. Charlotte approached him with a small wrapped package, her face serious with the importance of gift-giving. This is for you, Grandpapa. I made it myself. Charles unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal a small watercolor painting, clearly inspired by her mother's artistic endeavors. It showed Windsor Castle in winter, but with a rainbow arching over the towers and small figures that were obviously meant to represent their family standing together in the foreground. It's beautiful, Charlotte, Charles said, genuinely moved. Tell me about the rainbow. Mama taught me that rainbows come after storms, Charlotte explained. I wanted to paint our house with a rainbow because this year had some storms, but now we have colors again. The simple wisdom of her explanation reminded Charles why he had felt so strongly about including themes of hope and resilience in his Christmas message. Children understood these concepts intuitively, seeing beauty and meaning where adults might only see difficulty. As the morning continued, Charles observed the easy affection between Catherine and her children, the way they naturally included her in every activity while remaining subtly protective. George would automatically move a footstool closer when she sat down. Charlotte would bring her water without being asked. Louis would climb onto her lap for stories with extra gentleness. These small gestures spoke to a family that had learned to care for each other through crisis. By late morning, it was time to prepare for the Christmas service at St. George's Chapel. This would be Catherine's first major public appearance since completing her treatment, and Charles could see the mixture of anticipation and nervousness in her demeanor. The decision to attend had been made only recently, based on how she felt on the day itself. Are you certain you're up for this? William asked quietly as they prepared to leave for the chapel. I want to be there, Catherine replied firmly. Not because I feel obligated, but because I want to give thanks. This Christmas feels different from last Christmas, and I want to acknowledge that in a sacred space. The walk to St. George's Chapel was brief but significant. Catherine moved with careful grace, accepting William's arm for support while acknowledging the small crowd of well-wishers who had gathered despite the early hour. Charles watched the faces of those who had come to see them, noting the genuine warmth and relief in their expressions. These were people who had followed Catherine's journey from afar, praying for her recovery and celebrating her gradual return to public life. The service itself was intimate and meaningful. Charles found his attention divided between the familiar liturgy and his awareness of Catherine's presence in the pew nearby. She participated fully in the singing and prayers, her voice clear and strong during the hymns. When the priest offered prayers for all those facing health challenges and their families, Charles saw her bow her head with particular intentionality. After the service, as they walked back to the castle, Catherine fell into step beside Charles. Thank you again for what you're saying in today's message. I heard about the themes from William, and I want you to know how much it means to have our experience honored as part of something larger. Your courage has been an inspiration to all of us, Charles replied. If sharing that can help others facing similar challenges, then it serves exactly the purpose I hoped for. Christmas lunch was a festive affair, with extended family gathered around the large dining table in the state dining room. The conversation flowed easily, touching on family news, upcoming plans, and shared memories. Charles noticed how naturally Catherine participated in all of it, no longer the cautious patient managing her energy, but simply a beloved family member enjoying Christmas with people she cared about. As 3 p.m. approached, the family gathered in the drawing room where a large television had been arranged for watching the Christmas broadcast. This had become a tradition over the years, allowing the family to experience the King's message as the public would see it, rather than just as a formal recording session they had witnessed. Charles felt an unexpected nervousness as the broadcast time arrived. He had delivered 3 previous Christmas messages as king, but none had felt as personally significant as this one. The red BBC logo appeared on the screen, followed by the familiar opening music that had announced royal Christmas messages for generations. Then, there he was, seated at the desk in Windsor Castle, the carefully chosen background visible behind him. Charles watched himself as if viewing a stranger, noting his posture, his expression, his tone as he began to speak to the millions of people who would hear these words. The message began with traditional themes of faith, service, and gratitude. Charles spoke about the importance of community during difficult times, about the way people support each other through crisis, about finding hope in the midst of uncertainty. But then, as he had planned, the message took a more personal turn. This year, his televised self continued, our own family has faced health challenges that reminded us of the fundamental importance of love, support, and community during difficult times. We have witnessed extraordinary courage in the face of uncertainty, and we have been humbled by the outpouring of care and concern from people across the Commonwealth and beyond. Charles glanced at Catherine as these words filled the room. She was watching intently, her expression calm but emotional. William reached over and took her hand, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. "We have learned," the message continued, "that strength is not the absence of fear or difficulty, but the willingness to face challenges with grace while accepting the love and support of others. We have seen how vulnerability can become a form of courage, how sharing our struggles can help others feel less alone in their own difficult journeys." The king on television went on to connect these themes to the broader challenges facing the Commonwealth, speaking about economic uncertainty, climate concerns, and social divisions with the same honesty and hope that had characterized his discussion of personal health struggles. He emphasized the importance of supporting one another, of building communities that care for their most vulnerable members, of finding strength in unity during difficult times. As the message drew to its conclusion, Charles spoke directly about the meaning of Christmas during challenging times. The Christmas story itself reminds us that hope often comes in unexpected ways, that love can flourish even in difficult circumstances, that light can shine brightest when darkness seems overwhelming. As we gather with our families and communities this Christmas, may we remember that we are not alone in our struggles, that courage is something we can share with one another, and that tomorrow's hope is built on today's love and support. The broadcast ended with the traditional Christmas wishes and the national anthem. As the television screen returned to regular programming, the drawing room at Windsor Castle fell into a profound silence. Charles looked around at his family, trying to read their responses to what they had just witnessed. Charlotte was the first to speak, her young voice cutting through the quiet. "That was beautiful, Grandpapa. I think people will understand about being brave and scared at the same time." George nodded seriously. "And they'll know that Mama is strong, but that it's okay to need help sometimes." Louis, ever direct, simply said, "I'm glad you told them about being kind to people who are sick." Catherine wiped tears from her cheeks as she stood to embrace Charles. "Thank you," she whispered, "for honoring our experience while speaking to something much larger. For finding the right words when I couldn't find them myself." William joined the embrace, and, for a moment, the king found himself surrounded by the people who mattered most to him, feeling the weight of what had just been shared with the world. In the hours that followed, as Christmas Day continued with its traditional rhythms, responses to the Christmas message began to arrive. Margaret Hartwell brought regular updates as calls and messages poured in from Commonwealth leaders, religious figures, and members of the public. The Prime Minister of Canada called to express how moved she was by your words, Margaret reported during one update. She said the message would resonate particularly strongly with families dealing with health challenges during the holiday season. The Archbishop of Canterbury's office called as well, she continued. They're reporting that their phones haven't stopped ringing with people wanting to discuss the message, particularly the themes about community support and finding strength in vulnerability. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from ordinary people whose messages found their way to the palace through various channels. A cancer support group in Wales sent a collective thank you for giving voice to our experience. A family in New Zealand wrote that the message helped them have an important conversation about their own health challenges. Healthcare workers from across the Commonwealth expressed gratitude for the public acknowledgement of what they witnessed daily in their practice. As evening settled over Windsor Castle and the extended Christmas Day celebrations wound down, Charles found himself once again in his study, this time joined by Catherine and William. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, processing the day and its significance. "I keep thinking about all the people who watched today," Catherine said softly. "People sitting in hospital rooms, families dealing with their own crises, individuals feeling isolated by their struggles. If your words helped even one person feel less alone, then sharing our story was worth any discomfort." William nodded. "What struck me most was how you managed to honor Catherine's experience while speaking to universal themes. It felt personal without being invasive, meaningful without being exploitative." Charles felt a deep satisfaction at these words. This had been exactly his intention, to use his platform to acknowledge shared human experience while respecting individual dignity and privacy. "I've been thinking," Catherine continued, "about how this experience has changed my understanding of service. Before my diagnosis, I thought serving others meant always being strong, always having answers, always being able to give without needing to receive. This year taught me that sometimes serving others means allowing them to care for you, showing them that vulnerability and strength can coexist." As they continued to talk, Charles realized that his Christmas message had accomplished something beyond what he had initially intended. It had not only honored Catherine's courage and spoken to others facing similar challenges, but it had also modeled a new kind of royal leadership, one that could acknowledge struggle while maintaining dignity, that could show vulnerability while inspiring strength. The evening deepened around them, but the conversation continued, touching on hopes for the coming year, on lessons learned from the difficult months past, on the way personal experience could inform public service. Charles felt profoundly grateful for this family, for their trust in allowing him to share their story, for their wisdom in helping him find the right words. As they finally prepared to part ways for the evening, Catherine turned to Charles one last time. "This Christmas will always be special for me, not just because it marks my recovery, but because it's the Christmas when you used your voice to honor not just my experience, but the experience of everyone who faces challenges with courage. Thank you for seeing the larger story within our personal struggle." Later that night, alone in his study with only the dying embers of the fire for company, King Charles reflected on the Christmas message that would be remembered as one of his most significant. He had managed to honor Catherine's extraordinary year while speaking to the universal human experiences of challenge, courage, and community support. He had used the platform of the monarchy to acknowledge shared vulnerability while inspiring continued hope. The responses would continue to arrive in the days and weeks ahead, but Charles already knew that this Christmas message had achieved what he had hoped for. It had created space for honest conversation about difficulty and resilience. It had honored one person's courage while speaking to everyone's need for community during challenging times. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that leadership could be both strong and vulnerable, both personal and universal, both honest about struggle and hopeful about the future. As he finally made his way to bed, Charles felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from using power and position to serve something larger than oneself. The Christmas message would be remembered, but, more importantly, the themes it had explored would continue to resonate in the lives of people facing their own challenges, drawing strength from the knowledge that courage can be shared, that vulnerability can be a form of service, and that no one has to face difficulty alone.